Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mayor Steve Haggerty. Welcome to the first in a series of conversations that we're going to have as a community about policing here in Evanston. We are right now scheduled to have 5. I am open to adding additional topics of conversation here in the community. My purpose of hosting these meetings is to create a foundational level of knowledge among all of us, including myself, about the different procedures, training, budget items, and so forth related to policing here in Evanston. So the first 5 series that we have, this is the first one today. It's going to be focused on police training, and I'll have the participants introduce themselves in a minute. The next one we're going to have is going to be on July 13th, and that is going to be focused on the Evanston Police Department budget. I've received a lot of emails from individuals in the community asking us to defund the police. If we're going to examine our police department and our police operations, we have to examine the budget. I am committed to do that, as I articulated in a message I sent to the community just recently on that. The third in the series will be discussion between Evanston Police Department, Northwestern University Police Department, as well as our school resource officers that we have at ETHS in District 65. Again, I've received messages from people in the community wanting to better understand how that works and to have a discussion about that and possibly an elimination of that. The fourth one will be on use of force and body cameras. And then the final one right now that's scheduled, again, I'm open to additional ones, is going to be on the complaint process, findings and recommendations from a task force that I appointed a couple years ago. So we will talk about how all that works here in Evanston. We are live right now on the local TV channel, which is channel 16, as well as Facebook Live. If you have questions as this is going in, please post those questions. Patrick Degnan, who's our public information officer, will make an effort to push those to me through the Zoom chat function, and we will try to get those questions in. We've already received several questions from the community, so we'll get those answered today as well. So before we get right into the questions, what I'd like is for each of the panelists just to introduce themselves really quickly, and if they work for the City of Evanston, what their role is here with the City of Evanston. Then we have an outside guest as well, Chief Davis, who does a lot with training, and I'd like him to introduce himself. So let's start with you, Chief Cook, and your folks there.
Yes, Demetrius Cook, City of Evanston Police Chief.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jody Wright, Deputy Chief of Support Services.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gil Levy. I'm a sergeant in the Office of Administration. I handle the majority of training here at the department.
Thank you. And Chief Wright, when you speak, you were just a little muffled, I think, because of the mask. So when you do speak, if you can just either speak louder so folks can hear you. All right. And then we have a outside guest as well. Chief Davis, would you just like to introduce yourself, particularly your roles in other organizations that work with police departments around the state and country?
Absolutely, Mayor. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Mitchell Davis. I'm the police chief in the village of Hazel Crest. I'm also the president of the South Suburban Association of Chiefs of Police. I am the first vice president for the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police. Next year, when I become the president, I'll be the first African American in the 80-year history of the organization to hold that office. I am also on the board of directors for the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and I'm also a national executive board member for the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Do a lot of teaching on exactly what's going on right now. I've traveled around the country. We have a class called Leadership in Law Enforcement from a Black chief's perspective that I've traveled the country teaching, in addition to other classes. I'm also a member of the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. While I am a member of that board, probably most of the things, the perspectives that I'll bring will be from my experience as a chief and with the various organizations that I'm involved in. So thank you for having me, Mayor.
Great. Thank you, Chief, and congratulations on your honor.
Thank you, sir.
I think I'm going to start with you, Chief Davis, because of all your experience and all the training. There's a lot of demands out there from the public for change within policing in all different ways, right? People saying we want demilitarization, we don't want police in schools anymore. We want police defunded and all that. As someone who is a leading trainer out there, could you just share with our audience what are the 2 or 3, sort of biggest changes that are going on within police departments right now in terms of how officers are trained, and what those most recent changes are that you're seeing?
So, talk about de-escalation and things to that effect. Those have been things that the community has been fighting for some time, and they've been implemented to some extent in law enforcement. For me, everything that's going on right now is opportunity. That's the way I'm looking at it. I actually, as I mentioned to you, I've been fighting for some of the changes that are being demanded now. I've been fighting for some of those changes for many, many years as a police chief, and they've been heard, but now it appears as though there's going to be more action. As far as the training that is taking place, de-escalation, school officers, the different things that you mentioned. I've worked in schools for about 25 years, and having the police out of schools, in my opinion and in my experience, it's not about not having them in schools. It's about having the right officers in school and having the right program in school. If you have a structured program in the school and the officers are aware of what their expectations are, and you have the correct officers that are good with young people in the schools, there's over my years, thousands of young folks I've had positive interactions with that contact me today. They're adults. They got kids, just explaining how they were grateful for the relationships that they had. So with that, that's that's where the training that should be done and some of the changes that should be made as far as schools are concerned. As far as de-escalation, the biggest challenge that I see, and this is what I've been teaching, is the culture of law enforcement. The culture in law enforcement has to change. And the culture that I'm speaking of is historically, when it comes to marginalized communities and communities of color, law enforcement has policed the entire community. In other communities, they serve the community and they police the criminals. In Black communities, they police everybody. And that mindset and that culture is just all, if you look back in history, you got the slave catchers. They were slave catchers. When you look at the civil rights movement back in the 50s and 60s, the police were the persons who were putting dogs and fire hose. They were and beating kids and women in their Sunday best that were out there protesting. So that not necessarily to that extent, but that mentality of policing Black communities is well entrenched in our profession. And what happens is, so often we have good, well-intended people that come into this profession and they look up and the culture ends up sucking them in, and that implicit bias comes into play. And the implicit bias combined with the culture that exists can be toxic. And that's where it's incumbent upon leaders like you guys got Chief Cook. I mean, he's one of the greatest police chiefs that there is. I'm talking about demilitarization. When he was the director for our South Suburban Emergency Response Team, he already had things in place where he was going to change the uniforms out of the camo type of uniforms. That, hey, there's a job to be done, but it's not what you do, it's how you do it. So you got great leadership like that. It's the combination of that and attacking these concerns that's going to make the change, the needed change that needs to happen in law enforcement.
Thank you, Chief. And I know we're going to talk about implicit bias and other items on the when we get to the training questions. And again, we're going to do resource officers and all that in a different session that we're going to have in a couple of weeks. So, Chief, why don't we start with you or one of your folks there. What training do individuals receive prior to becoming a police officer here in Evanston? And what basic qualifications and requirements are needed to become a police officer, including if there's educational requirements? I know people are interested in that as well.
Thank you, Mayor. Can you hear me okay with the mask?
I can. I'm going to let Patrick chime in because he monitors more things along with Anderson if they say that the viewers are having trouble hearing you, Sergeant.
Okay. If you can't hear me, just let me know. So I'll address that question. As far as new police officers, a new patrol officer, we do have educational requirements to be hired. And that is a high school diploma or a GED equivalent plus 60 hours of college credit. When an officer is hired by the Evanston Police Department, they are sent to the police academy. We in Evanston, we use a few different academies. We send our members to the Chicago Police Academy. We send them to the Cook County Sheriff's Police Academy, and then we also use the South Suburban Law Enforcement Academy, which is at the College of DuPage. The state of Illinois has laid out standards of what the academies need to cover as far as training, as well as the amount of time. So the state standard is now 560 hours of training. Now that training includes defensive and control tactics. It includes firearms training. It includes classroom training over law. It basically, in that 560 hours, it covers all the things that we want to make sure officers are getting initially. And then that training, which we'll get into later, continues over the course of the career. But that initial training at the academy prepares officers to take a state certification exam, which they must pass to continue on to the police department. Once the academy section of training is complete for a new officer, the training isn't over then. When they come to us, they enter into the field training program, which for us is a 20-week program where they're matched up with a field training officer who themselves receive training in becoming an instructor in field training. So the recruits at that point will ride with the field training officer in uniform, responding to calls for service, handling everything. And that is what you call kind of the on-the-job learning. And then, like I said, that continues for 20 weeks. There's weekly and daily evaluations of the recruit officers done not only by the field training officer, but the shift sergeant. And then we also have a field training coordinator that oversees the entire program and monitors the effectiveness of the program itself, as well as the progress that the recruits are making.
When somebody they've gotten out of the academy, and I just want to make sure I understand this too, it's when they get out of the academy that they take that exam, or is there exam before they're in the academy that they're taking, or both times?
The exam is at the end of the academy. So
at the end of the academy, you have to pass the exam. You then, join the police department here. You've got 20 weeks of a field training program where you are working directly with another officer. Are you on probation at that time? Can you talk to our viewers about that? And have we ever had a situation where somebody has either been in the academy and not a good fit and been tossed out, or, for the 20-week training program, just didn't have what we expect officers to have here in Evanston?
Yes, sir. We've had both circumstances that you mentioned. Either for whatever reason, discipline, just not a good fit, like you said, in the academy, they can be asked to leave during the academy. And then again, if they're not meeting the standards that we're setting, once they come to us after the academy, yes, they can be asked to leave then as well. Now, as far as the probation, new officers are actually on probation for much longer than that. Their probation begins when they graduate the academy and actually start here. It's a 2-year probation, and within that 2 years, they don't have the, if you want to call it, the protection of the union. They're at-will employees, and if there are any issues that come up while they're on probation, it's a different process to terminate them or ask them to leave than it is with established officers. But it is a constant evaluation and review throughout probation, not just the field training program. Mm-hmm. But I would also like to add, I neglected to mention that a couple years ago, here in Evanston, we incorporated a lot of Evanston-specific training and information in the field training program. We recognize the special community that we have here, the unique history, and we recognize the fact that the training that the officers receive in the police academy may not, while they're learning the laws, while they're learning best practices, it may not be specific to the city of Evanston, things that we want them to come away with. And that's why we have such a long, in-depth field training program to kind of give it our own blend of training mixed in with what is required by the state.
So education-wise, it sounded like they have to have a high school degree, or you said they could have a GED, but they have to have at least 60 hours of college credit. So if memory serves me, that's basically like an associate's degree. Is that right? I mean, because 120 credits, at least when I graduated, that was about what it was. So how many of our officers here in Evanston would you say have college degrees versus just associate degrees, or no degree if they didn't get their associates, and how many have graduate level degrees? And if you guys needed to research that and come back later today or at a different series, we could do that too. But I think that's something that it's on my mind. I think other people would be interested as well.
Sure. And that's an easy thing to come up with. A little bit later I can get it. I will say a majority of officers here do have a college degree. And as far as promotional purposes, promotion to the command level requires a bachelor's degree. Anything above sergeant, so commander, deputy chief, and chief, does require a college degree. A number of sergeants and commanders do hold advanced degrees as well, but I can get you those numbers.
Okay, all right. Chief Davis, question for you. Sergeant Levy just talked about the added training that Evanston, provides to their officers, Evanston specific type of training that we want. Can you share with me and others that are watching, what's the basis for all of the training that's out there? Like, where is the basic training at the academy? Where is that emanating from? And how do changes get made to that training in the academies?
So the training for the academies is dictated specifically by the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. So there's so many hours in each subject matter that has to happen, and those total hours actually just got increased over the last couple years due to additional training for dealing with mental illness and things to that effect. But the Training and Standards Board specifically dictates what is required, and the academy is certified by the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. So all the academies across the board are going to have those same elements no matter where you send your person to the academy at across the state of Illinois. And that state exam that they all have to pass at the end of the academy is also something that is developed by the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. And as the sergeant said, every department then has their own field training program. There are standards out there for field training. Being a field training officer, there's a certification process for being a field training officer that departments should have for their officers. And those are your most important people in the police department, because they're developing your newest people, your newest officers. So it's so important that you have the right, not from a knowledge standpoint so much from doing stuff on the street, but from a dealing with people and developing minds of new officers to make sure that they are in line with what your community is expecting of your officers.
With the George Floyd incident, we saw not only the officer who had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, which was hard for anyone to watch. We saw other officers not intervene. And from a training perspective, are officers in general, Chief Davis, and then specific to Evanston, Chief Cook, are they trained that if they are with another officer who is not following protocol, to intervene? And
So
then,
that's-
not only intervene, but then report them, because lots of incidents happen. There's nobody there other than maybe a suspect and the police to then report that.
So historically, I don't think that has been pushed. That's a cultural thing, and it's becoming more of a policy thing. People are specifically putting those measures in their policies now. I know it's now in my policy, and it was not that specific thing. You would think that you wouldn't have to tell somebody that to stop killing this guy. You would think that wouldn't be something. Policies and procedures are supposed to be guidelines. They don't cover every little thing, but that's where culture comes into place. Culture comes into place, and there's the culture within the organization affects the way that people act within the organization. And for somebody not to have the wherewithal to have stopped that incident was a cultural thing. And from a person, all the training in the world, it doesn't change the culture. So it's got to be a two-pronged approach, and putting systems in place so that officers not only are held accountable from a policy standpoint, but they're safe. They feel safe, and to be able to report these officers and report these circumstances. All those things have to be taken into account for things to happen. So to answer your question, quite honestly, it hasn't been. I don't believe it's been taught a whole lot. It may be now it's at the forefront. Now things are at the forefront. But once again, you would think that you wouldn't have to specifically put that, but we've gotten to the point where obviously we do.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Chief Cook?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with Chief Davis. I can remember that code of silence with respect to how people were handled in the past, where it was clearly several officers on the scene watching a particular incident go down, and it was an injury to a person. And by the time that paperwork was completed, either everybody had the same story, or you had individuals that would say, I was there, but I didn't see anything. But a number of years ago, in my perspective from here in Evanston, under Chief Frank Kaminsky, they started holding officers accountable who were on the scene, who should have known. If I'm on the scene, and this was prior to body cameras, if we felt that you were at the scene and you were actively involved in whatever investigation or arrest was going on, it is your duty to say something. And that always didn't happen, as Chief Davis said. But it has become more prevalent in policy. In particular, is part of the Lexapol policies. The Lexapol is a standard general order based on Illinois law that a number of police departments utilize. But I think cost prohibits a lot of departments from purchasing those orders. And in the use of force order under the Lexapol policies, it's a section for duty to intercede. And that basically says that it is your duty as a police officer to stop another police officer from overstepping the law and what's permissible under the law against a suspect. So we have that in our policies here. And like Chief Davis said, the organizational culture in law enforcement is a problem. So how do you deal with changing the organizational culture? You constantly preach what you expect. Whenever we review these situations, a use of force, first thing we go to is the body cameras, and we look at who's around. We look at everybody's body camera, and then we determine, even if it's a supervisor, because supervisor responsibility is held to a greater standard than just a police officer. So that is how we base taking action and moving forward, and hopefully over time changing that organizational culture.
I appreciate you mentioning that, Chief, because Jess, I think it's Jerica, either Jerica or Jessica, may have been mistyped here in my group chat, did just ask that question about how does cultural change happen. So I appreciate you mentioning that, because I think that's the the big thing that needs to occur at a lot of police departments across this country. So you mentioned body cameras. Can you talk to us about how body cameras are used to monitor performance? I mean, obviously they're used if someone feels disrespected by the police or there was a serious incident, and then the body camera footage is reviewed. But there are tens of thousands of hours of body camera footage that's captured. Do you use that in training in any way, or to monitor performance of your officers, or just to spot check all your officers?
Yeah, we do, Mayor. So when we first implemented body cameras, we worked with the unions, and one of the things that we put in policy is that the sergeants or the first line supervisors, they're required to do monthly checks, just random checks. So what they do is they look at each individual officer, they look at the calls for service that they responded to over a course of a month. And then what they do is they do random checks of those calls for service to, one, make sure that the officer activated their body camera according to policy, and then two, to look at that interaction and make sure that the officer handled the call appropriately. So that's done every month by the first line supervisors with every patrolman or officer within a police department.
Good. I'm really pleased to hear that. Good.
And we have, and just to take it a step further, we have had situations where the supervisors have done those random checks and couldn't find the body camera. And just so everyone knows, that's a violation of policy also. So if a supervisor does a check and that body camera footage doesn't exist, and it should exist, then we issue discipline based on violation of the policy for not having the body camera activated when it should be.
Hey everyone, this is Patrick. The mayor just briefly dropped off, but I'll kind of try and pick up where he left off. He's going to be jumping back on in a second. So a general question we received was, do all Evanston police officers receive training in de-escalation?
So I can speak to that. I mean, the short answer to that is yes. And you know, the response to that one kind of touches on some of the other questions that were raised. But de-escalation is taught to every police officer from their days in the academy. And it, you know, now a lot of people are speaking about de-escalation, but it's something that officers have been trained in one way or another for, you know, throughout the history of law enforcement. So it is incorporated into a lot of other trainings. For example, firearms training isn't just walking up to a target and shooting. There's commands that the officers give prior to shooting. There are situations where we call it a no-shoot situation, where an officer may have their firearm out, but they are instructed to use de-escalation and verbal judo tactics to de-escalate that situation, and then it turns into a no-shoot situation. That's just an example. Taser training, same thing. Any of our use of force training incorporates de-escalation training into it. Chief Cook had mentioned Lexipol, which is how we manage and distribute our policies. There's daily training bulletins from the Lexipol policies that are distributed to all the officers, all the members of the department. And, you know, one of the most frequent daily training sessions is on use of force and de-escalation, how to do it. The department works with outside entities to conduct training, one of which is NEMRT, which stands for the Northeast Multi-Regional Training, and that is an arm of the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board, which Chief Davis mentioned. NEMRT has specific de-escalation training courses that we'll send officers to throughout the year. You know, depending on budget, schedule, officer availability, we'll send people to that we identify that could benefit from it. And then they bring that training back to the department for their shifts, for their bureaus, In addition to that, the department uses another online training platform, which every month is a different topic. It's an online lesson followed by a test that the officers need to complete and pass. As recently as I'll have it in a moment, but de-escalation training is part of that monthly training as well. Like I said, it's a different topic month to month, but de-escalation, use of force, implicit bias is a regular topic that comes through the rotation more often than others.
We just got a question from Ann on Facebook, and I'm not sure if you have this information offhand, but she asked if the Evanston Police Department has any officers who've graduated from Western Illinois University's Law Enforcement and Justice program.
Yes, we have a number of officers. We can get those numbers too, but a number of officers on the Evanston Police Department graduated from Western Illinois University. I think Deputy Chief Pickett, who just retired, was a graduate of that program. So we have a long history of police officers who graduated from the law enforcement program in Western Illinois and some in Southern Illinois programs that are now currently police officers here.
Another question we received was, how are police officers trained to respond to individuals in crisis or those suffering from mental health issues?
And Patrick, just so you know, I'm back online.
Yeah, the critical incident. A number of, we have a large population. We have 160 or so police officers here, and about 95 of those officers, I believe, have completed the critical incident training that teaches officers how to deal with individuals in mental crisis, distress. We've had officers that have completed that training, talk people down from committing suicide and things of that nature. This is a very critical part of our training, is this CIT trained officers. And if anybody that listens to the scanner in Chicago, you'll hear a lot of times they're calling for a CIT trained officer to respond to a scene. That being a much larger organization takes a greater amount of time for them to come up to speed. But we've committed to we've been sending 2 officers per class through that training, and now we have a really large population of police officers across section, all bureaus and all shifts that are CIT trained.
Looks like the mayor is just unmuting. You're back.
Thank you, Chief. I'm sorry. I had a massive computer failure, and it went out. It went out completely. Did you, Sergeant Levy? And Patrick may have asked this when I got cut off and had to relog back on. What training do officers receive on a yearly basis? Did you cover that? And if you did, that's great. Could you tell us, like, the number of, professional development or continuing education hours that officers have here in Evanston? Is there a minimum requirement set by the state or some association? And then how many do we have here in Evanston?
Sure.
I just want to speak on the command level first, and then I'll let Sergeant Levy. The city of Evanston has spent a considerable amount of money in investing in the education of officers in the management area. And I consider management from sergeant on up: sergeant, commander, deputy chief, and chief. Last year, we sent about 7 or 8 officers through the Center for Public Safety, sergeants at Northwestern University, and they graduated through the Staff and Command program there. We also sent, I think, 3 or 4 officers through the 3-week executive leadership class there. And these are some of the best classes you're going to find in law enforcement anywhere in America. We currently have a couple of officers scheduled to attend the SMIP, which is the Senior Management Institute for Police at Harvard University. Those are our upper management personnel. That class gives them the insight into critical incidents, how to handle some really complex ethical dilemmas. One of the big topics at PERF is race. How do you develop a racial equity issue program within your police department? So it's been a number of classes on the command level that aren't necessarily required, but in the interest of good public service, it has been something that the city has invested greatly in.
Okay. What about for the patrol officers themselves? Is there a minimum number of hours that they receive training each year?
So the answer to that is yes and no. As far as a specific time allotment, there's less that than there is specific classes that do need to be done either annually or different time lengths. So the state of Illinois controls that, and they initiated a bunch of training mandates for law enforcement. Some training is annually, as I mentioned, and some is every 2 years, every 3 years, and it's broken down. And every department, everyone has access to see what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, the frequency and whatnot. So, for example, you had mentioned, mental health, and Chief Cook mentioned the CIT training. Additionally, that not CIT training specifically, but mental health awareness is a state mandate. And it is required that annually officers, I apologize, every 3 years, officers go through a mental health awareness training program. Now, we work with the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board to take that training to our officers. Either we send them to a class or they are able to take that one in particular online. So that's just one example. Another example is firearm qualifications. Just because of the seriousness of that is obviously an annual requirement for qualification. Law updates, which change frequently, annual mandate, annual training. Use of force, annual training. Something like constitutional and proper use of authority, that is a mandate that is every 3 years requires training. While the state sets those mandates, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only time we do those trainings. We do them much more frequently than that when we're able, but there is that requirement that the state sets as far as what needs to be done.
Just to add, the Chief and Sergeant Levy talked about our crisis intervention training. We do have maybe 70% of our department trained in crisis intervention. I think we are ahead of a lot of departments just based on the initiative from our individual officers. This training started some years back, and we just sent a couple of officers to this training. It was the word of mouth from those officers that came back saying, "Hey, this is a great training." Mentioning it to the training staff, this is something that everyone should attend. And then we start pushing on officers, with the help of outside training facilities, 2 or 3 people in a month, sometimes 4 or 5 back in 2016 and 2017. And we were able to snatch up a lot of those classes that other departments, those seats in those classes that other departments weren't utilizing. Another thing that I think shows the effectiveness of that training is that in addition to the officers coming back saying this is a good training, we had officers on scene watching those CIT trained officers handle situations, and they would come back and put in for that class because they wanted the training. I remember my times in OPS when I would get phone calls and we would get letters to the department saying from citizens saying how well officers handle a situation, a crisis situation, And I think that's a testament to that initial 40 hours of crisis intervention training, because it's an intense 40 hours that the officers are able to learn and develop skills over the course of a week, as opposed to a lot of trainings now where you're getting an 8-hour training here, then have to find another spot, 8-hour training 2 months later. But that initial 40 hours of intense training, I believe, was critical to the development of those officers.
Thank you, Deputy Chief. Chief Davis, a question for you. We've talked about some of the training here. I'm curious if you're hearing, if you're not hearing anything that you ought to be hearing in terms of what we're doing here in Evanston. But I'm also curious, do we ask too much of the police? When you talk about all this different training, crisis intervention, mental health, everything else, are we asking officers to do too much these days?
Well, I would say no, but what has happened is when our social programs were eliminated. So we're talking, this kind of goes into defunding. Mm-hmm. You hear the terminology and the request to defund the police. Well, what happened was there were social services that have already been defunded. And what happened with those social services is now they are falling on law enforcement. Dealing with the homeless, dealing with the mentally ill, dealing with substance abuse issues. We're just cut that way. We're going to do what we have to do to serve our communities. But when those social service programs were defunded, those now services fell primarily on law enforcement. And once again, we adapt and conquer. We keep going. We train our officers to try to equip them as best we can. But what hasn't happened is with the added responsibility, we didn't get added funding. Mm-hmm. We just had to do what we had to do in order to prepare ourselves to deal with these things. So, do I think that the community, the society is asking too much? I don't, because once again, we do what we do, but there are areas where we can improve to provide us with assistance. And there are, I spoke on Capitol Hill back in October, and it was specifically National League of Cities was hosting a panel, and it was specifically about law enforcement handling homelessness, substance abuse, and mental illness. And I was so pleasantly surprised that there are communities out there, and most of them are larger communities. They're like Evanston's or something like that. They're not Hazel Crest. We just don't have the resources. But there are communities out there that are being proactive, that have people on their payroll that, when a dispatcher gets a call of a certain type, if it's found that it's somebody in mental crisis, they got specialists that will respond. The police won't respond. If it's a homeless person, if it's something dealing with hey, there's some people sleeping under the bridge or whatever the case may be, they've got specific people. And while we do get training, a 40-hour class is not going to equip us as well as somebody who is a professional that deals with these circumstances every day, all day. And so when I hear the whole defunding, and I know this is going to be another topic, when I hear the whole defunding thing, that's what, like I said, I'm looking at all this as opportunity. This is an opportunity for resources to be re-implemented. Some of those social programs that were taken off the table that can now assist us and allow us to partner with those true professionals that really know what they're doing. And as far as the training, what you guys are doing or may not be doing, Chief Cook is, as far as he walks on water. That's how much I respect and admire that guy. If you had to build a community, a chief, but for a community that's all about community, he'd be your model. He'd be the person that you would pick their brain. So he's doing. I know he and his staff are doing the things that need to be done. But just one thing that's important for the viewers to know, that in addition, a couple of years ago, in addition to it, and Chief Cook was instrumental in some of this stuff too, in addition to our annual use of force, a percentage of that use of force has to be scenario based. So it's not all just theory. And one of the ways that we get that scenario based training is through simulators and things like that. And Chief Cook was, I would say he was pretty much solely responsible. We have a system out in the south suburbs that all of our departments are utilized for scenario-based training. And when he was in the south suburbs, he was the man that was pretty much single-handedly responsible for us. I think it was almost $1 million system, and he was responsible for us obtaining that. So you guys are in great hands.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I'm going to direct my next question then to the chief based on what you said. I will say those simulators, I wish we had enough time on them that every citizen could get the opportunity to do a simulator. I have, along with one of my aldermen, and I was shot and killed not once but twice. So, it really puts you in the moment and the tough judgment calls that need to be made by officers out there every day. Chief, building off of what Chief Davis just said, Ann had a question, which is, what do you have, what goals do you have, Chief, to improve training for Evanston officers?
Well, a lot of things. First of all, Mayor, I like to thank Chief Davis. I appreciate those kind words. But my funds are limited. So what I did in the south suburbs, what Chief Davis is talking about, is I was able to network with other agencies on the county level and the federal level, for instance. So that $1 million virtual machine that I got out south was from me filling out a grant with the Department of Homeland Security and receiving that grant, and also receiving another $550,000 for a command SWAT vehicle. But my goals are to network more and try to see. We used to be able to do in-house training through our own in-house experts. But now, with the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board, all of our classes have to be certified through them. And we have people in-house that have the credentials to teach. It's just a matter of their curriculum being certified through the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. So one of my goals is to have us get some of our in-house trainers write a program and get them certified where they can teach in-house and we receive credit. I do believe in having strong relationships with our neighbors. And Skokie has been a really good neighbor since I've been here in terms of utilizing equipment. That same $1 million shooting simulator that Chief Davis was talking about, Skokie has one, and Chief Scarpelli last week, which everybody said he wouldn't let us use. I called him, he said, no problem. So we're gonna be able to send the people from the Citizen Police Commission through that simulator to give them an opportunity to view real life use of force situations involving handguns. And that'll give them a greater perspective on how to view what the police officer does. So getting our training certified, networking with our neighbors, that's what I'm planning.
Thank you, Chief. I'm going to ask all of us now, we're going to go into a rapid round because we got a lot of questions from folks and I want to get through them and wrap this up in no more than 15 minutes because that will have given us an hour here. I do want to remind everybody watching, we've received a lot of questions, so thank you. We're focusing today just on training. The other questions for our series that we're going to have and other conversations, we will get those questions answered. Okay, so these are going to be focused on training. We're going to do rapid rounds, so quick, crisp responses. Carla asked if you can detail what type of implicit bias is being given as professional development on a continuous basis to members of the EPD.
Sure. Implicit bias training goes in hand a lot of times with procedural justice training for us. We have 3 in-house instructors that did a department-wide training a couple years back. before COVID-19 happened, we were working with the Anti-Defamation League, who has a specific program for law enforcement about implicit bias training. We're working to try to get that back once things normalize a little bit. And as well, the monthly online training that we conduct that every officer goes through, that has a month dedicated to implicit bias training as well, which the officers all take the lesson and take the test at the end of it.
Great, thank you. And so Alexis had two questions. What types of anti-racist training do officers receive and how regularly? And then what is the training around interacting with youth specifically? And I know, Chief, that's something you and I have discussed on a prior meeting, as we're worried that because of the pandemic, less youth have jobs and everything else and are just out and about. And we just want to make sure that interaction is a positive interaction, ideally. So we'll start with what types of anti-racist training do officers receive and how regularly. I think, again, implicit bias cuts across. Implicit bias is everything. It's not just race. It's, biases that we all have. And then this one's really getting at more, I think, racial bias and again, being anti-racist.
Well, the city of Evanston sponsored a trainer from Atlanta that put on a really good implicit bias program. I've been a certified cultural diversity instructor myself with the state of Illinois for the last 25 years. And just recently I completed, within the last 2 years, the implicit bias training that Northwestern University put on at the law school down on Superior Street. To say racist specific, it's a mixture of implicit bias, race, and making people understand what other communities are about. That's done in a number of ways here, not only through training, but through actual interaction with the public, through our problem-solving team, who are out in the neighborhoods across all sections of this town, interacting and understanding what the concerns are and what people feel about the police department.
Can you talk, Chief, just real quickly about how you approach the march? There's a lot out there about the militarization of the police and everything. And Evanston Fights for Black Lives had 5,000 to 10,000 people, march through Evanston a month ago. Just take our viewers real quickly, like through the thought process of how you all wanted to, either police that event or really not even police it, but keep people safe during that event, and how you thought about that, especially with everything that was going on around the country.
Well, Evanston is a unique town. We understand our residents and we understand that they have a right to protest. When we have a large protest like that, our perspective is just to provide a safe route and protection for our crowd. We don't want somebody driving through there with a car. That happens in America these days. We don't want people to feel like we don't trust them by having police real visible. So when we had the march with the high school, we had our officers staged off of the route, only the officers to block traffic at the intersections. And, by doing it like that, we had a situation in front of the station yesterday where we had children painting. It'll do more harm than good to intercede into that. I think long as people aren't harming each other, they voicing their rights, we try to manage it. We are here though to protect city assets and not create costs, unnecessary costs for the general public. So, it's a lot that goes into planning these events.
Thank you. Question from, I don't know if we really answered the type of training around interacting with youth specifically.
Yes, now we have, it's at the city manager level now, but when I came here, I wanted to increase the interaction with youth. So we took the model that is currently in the districts in Chicago, and I had Mr. David Cherry and Commander Garner research the Youth Advisory Committee. And those are district level interactions in Chicago that they have with youth. And I had been involved with the STEM program here in Evanston, at Evanston High School. And I found that we have some incredibly smart students at that school, and their opinion is going to shape the future. So we want to have that youth advisory committee here in our department. We have a young lady right here now, Maya. She's one of the Hickey Powell Foundation students who's interested in law enforcement, and she's shadowing me to see how I operate, and they rotate around. So we do a lot to interact with youth.
Mm-hmm. Right. Not to mention, we have a community outreach group here in Evanston that's been in our city for many years. That is out there doing outreach to young people throughout our community, as well as working on workforce development issues for them, as well as working with the Mayor's Summer Youth Employment Program. I think people would be very interested, Chief, especially at this moment, on the Youth Advisory Council that you talked about setting up something similar to Chicago. So I think the sooner you could set up such a committee, probably the better. And again, we're having a series of these, so if in a future one you have details and you want to share, we can get folks, I'm sure, that would be interested in applying to be on that committee. So,
yes.
All right, real quick, just a few more questions, and I do want to be sensitive of people's time. Karen asked, this is not the Karen everyone's thinking about, that everybody talks about Karen out there. How are officers trained to counteract an increase in violent crime, such as shootings?
Well, we try to use only the force necessary to effect the arrest. That's what the state law says. Only the force necessary to effect the arrest. Constant, the state mandates that we qualify with our weapons once a year. We do that many times a year so that we can be as proficient as possible with any weapon we have, whether it's a taser or a handgun. And in the event of a situation, we'll be able to show the amount of training that far exceeds what is required by the state.
Okay. All right. Thank you. How about Chief Davis, since you do training all over, and this seems to be a standard protocol, why are police officers, this person's asking, this is Karen as well, why are police officers not trained to ask a person that is pulled over to step out of the car instead of remaining in the car? And she says, wouldn't that provide the officer and the individual with better protection if they were outside the vehicle?
Well, asking somebody to exit their vehicle is more invasive, and that's why the circumstances dictate whether or not we ask somebody out of their vehicle. Once again, most times we're stopping folks is for some type of traffic violation, and asking them to get out of their car, it just is more invasive. So we are trained to deal with individuals that are in their car, so we're adequately trained to be able to manage those situations, and being in the car also it has its pluses and minuses. So it also keeps the person is contained, and it can make things a little bit easier for us to deal with, but it does call for us to have some heightened awareness.
From all the training that we get when we learn to drive and everything, if an officer pulls you over, practically everybody's had an officer pull them over at one time or another for something, you stay in the car and you keep your hands on the wheels. That's what we're trained to do, right? So, and I know when people jump out of the car, it makes officers pretty nervous.
Yeah, that's not normal.
No, right. And it's just important for everybody to understand that. Sharon had a question, Chief. I'll direct this to you or to Deputy Chief Hart. This is from Sharon. What is the same and what is different now after that 2015 Lawrence Crosby incident that we had. And that was over on Ridge Avenue. Yeah, so what's and we did a big review after that, and the city changed some police policies. Can you just talk real briefly about that and let our viewers know, because that's still on the minds of a lot of us here in the city?
Yeah, well, I saw when I was out south, I saw the video of Mr. Crosby being accosted by the police, and I had a conversation with Chief Eddington about that and got his perspective on it. When I came here, they were in the final phases of allocation of money for making Mr. Crosby whole from the actions of the police. My job became then is to ensure that the officers involved had the proper training to not do that again. It was a supervisor involved in that, and in order to make him whole, I had to send him to Northwestern University Stafford Command, and he's in the process of completing that course now. So, anytime you have an incident that's catastrophic like that, you have to provide the proper training so that people know what they did is wrong, and that makes it easier for you to move forward in the future if they do something with a disciplinary action.
Yeah, I think a big takeaway from that is the protocols and the procedures may not always reflect what our community standards are. And so after that incident, there was a review of those procedures, and I know Chief Eddington and his team made changes to those procedures, reported back to the Human Services Committee here in Evanston to try and avoid that type of situation that occurred. So let's one question, then a wrap-up question for each of you, and we'll finish up. Can you talk? This is from Charles. Do police, when there's an incident, do police always respond to the residents' questions or whoever? Again, I'm not quite sure I understand, Charles. The specific question is, why aren't police required to respond to residents' questions? Is this part of their training? So, I mean, we have two situations. We have someone who might be a suspect of something or pulled over, and they may have questions. Why was I pulled over? What did I do wrong? And then there may be a bystander or somebody that walks by that has a litany of questions as well. So could you just talk to both of those scenarios so our viewers understand what protocols are there?
Sure. So, like you said, each situation will be different. If you're a suspect and you're being pulled over and you're asking questions as to why you're being pulled over, the police officer should tell you at that initial contact, this is the reason why I'm stopping you. This is who I am, and give them an explanation of why they're being stopped at that present time and in that moment. And it should be clear to the person that's being stopped why they're being stopped. As it relates to just a general call for service and you're a bystander walking by, there's a lot of things that may come into play, primarily the privacy of the individual that we may be there to serve. Not every situation will dictate us informing a citizen right away, as to what's going on at that particular time. We may be able to give them just general information. Hey, we're responding to, a call for service and someone that's asking for help. But that may be all we may be able to tell them at that time, just for privacy issues. In addition to that, if we have like a big crime scene out and we're conducting a serious investigation, a lot of the things we don't want to put out right away to protect the integrity of the investigation. So there could be several reasons why, but primarily for privacy and to protect the investigation will be the main two if you're just a bystander walking by.
No, thank you, Deputy Chief. All right, let's end with this question. How does and I'm going to ask this of the two chiefs. So we'll start with you, Chief Cook. How does the Evanston Police Department and officers improve and learn from their mistakes?
Well, I'm hoping that, like we discussed earlier, that people understand that it's a a culture, or we're trying to develop a culture of being positive to the community. We're trying to develop a culture of being safe in our interactions with the community and limit over policing any community. I think that training and keeping that in perspective, I think, is the key to folks learning how to maintain civility with our citizens, because it's just some things we're not going to tolerate here from the police officer. And hopefully they'll learn when they see another officer that made a mistake. They'll learn from the disciplinary action that he received and the training that the officer goes to. You come back and spread it to his comrades. So it's an ongoing process, but we hoping that they'll learn from their mistakes by education, knowing that it's a system of discipline here, and knowing that we're going to be consistent with it throughout our everyday interactions with the public.
Okay, thank you, Chief. And then Chief Davis, we'll end on you. You just heard Chief Cook's response to that. How does the Evanston EPD and officers improve and learn from their mistakes? Is there anything that you would want to add in terms of how other departments are continuously improving and learning from past mistakes?
So there's an expression that I heard some time ago that I used in some of my trainings, and it says that it's hard to hate up close. And with that in mind, that's some of the things from a leadership standpoint that I try to focus on. I believe that almost everything in life revolves around relationship. And if we can get our officers to experience and understand empathy for those that they serve, that is how we move forward. So that's the main thing, is to, as a leader, have systems in place to first and foremost make sure that your department knows where you stand from an ideal standpoint and from a value standpoint. And as Chief Cook said, what will and will not be tolerated underneath that respective leadership. And with putting systems in place to allow for your folks to be able to get to know the people that they serve. You know what? I might be arresting you for something, but if I know you and I understand you, I might understand why you did what you did, and it doesn't necessarily excuse what you did, but I'm going to treat you in a different light in doing so. And so those are the things that I push is get to know those folks. So there are people, there's going to be people within our ranks that may or may not have proper mindset. I'll just put it that way. They may have not necessarily implicit but explicit bias that they are well aware of, and that's just their train of thought. But as a leader, you've got to make it clear that, however you may feel, those things are against what my leadership philosophies are. They will not be tolerated, and there will be consequences for them. And we want to just treat people. Golden rule comes into play. Treat people the way you would want yourself. If this was your family member, if this was you that you were arresting or dealing with, how would you want them treated? And if you keep that at the forefront of your mind, then we should be okay.
Thank you, Chief, and thank you for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it. That was Chief Mitchell Davis, who's the Vice President of the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police and a board member of the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board, and also the Chief of Police of Hazel Crest Police Department. And so thank you, Chief Cook. Thank you, Deputy Chief Wright and Sergeant Levy. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is a series of conversations on policing here in Evanston. This was the first one today. This will run on Channel 16 throughout the week. Probably it's live right now, but come Wednesday, it'll be up there and run. And then next Monday, we will have our second in the series, and that is going to be on the Evanston Police Department budget. We will have a few of our folks from the budget office here, and we'll actually do a split screen of sorts. So you'll actually be able to see the numbers. We won't just talk about the numbers, and can have that conversation. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Evanston, when it comes to our police, I think is doing a lot of things right here. I think we have implemented a lot of progressive changes over the years, including our alternatives to arrest committee and handling that here locally instead of in the county criminal court. Having our citizens review our complaint process, as well as the 9 citizens recently who were just appointed to the Citizen Police Review Commission. And we'll start to review complaints that come up, as well as implementing body cameras. So still lots of work to do, but I think we're on the right track, and we will see you all next Monday. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you, Chief Davis. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.